Okay, so about 2 years ago I did a Dracula double bill for my Halloween review. There I talked about Coppola's version with Gary Oldman and the Mel Brooks spoof Dracula, Dead and Loving It. And if you saw that review, you know I wasn't exactly thrilled with it. So this year I'm here to offer you another Dracula-themed comedy, and one that's actually competent. Love at First Bite, following hot on the heels of Young Frankenstein, is another parody of a famous movie monster, this time everyone's favourite Transylvanian vampire. However, this time the Count and his servant Renfield are evicted by the new Romanian regime and decide to emigrate to then present-day New York. Once there, not only do they find a world far removed from the fog and crypts of their homeland, but Dracula also finds another reincarnation of his eternal love, Mina, here a model called Cindy, whom he sets out to woo. Hijinks ensue. Leading the charge is George Hamilton as Dracula, who is simply excellent. Rather than just lazily channel Lugosi like Leslie Nielsen would do in the other big spoof of Dracula, Hamilton gives the role a legitimate air of dignity. He has the accent and get-up of Lugosi, sure, but not to the point of being excessively cartoony, as I'm sure was very tempting, while his high and his face are much more in line with somebody like Christopher Lee, a sort of epitome of the tall, dark stranger type. Instead, supplying us in the zany category, we have Arte Johnson as Renfield, and future director Richard Benjamin, whom you would know from films like My Favorite Year, Racing to the Moon, and Milk Money. But here he's the great-grandson of Van Helsing, although he has since abandoned the family's legacy of vampire hunting and has become a psychiatrist in the Big Apple. While Johnson adds a strange likability to the usually maverick and oddball Renfield, Benjamin just cracks over the course of the film, as despite technically being the rational voice in all this, everyone just dismisses him as a nut, and he absolutely runs with it, and he is a lot of fun to watch and works well with Hamilton. Susan St. James as Cindy, the last of our main quartet, on the other hand, doesn't really have much to do save for being an inversion of the typically dainty love interest in vampire films, and though she does it well, and sort of has a nice dryness to her, she doesn't move much beyond being that one-note joke. Moving along to technicals, while the film is mostly directed in a pretty routine fashion given the New York setting, the opening sequence in Transylvania is sublime. Stan Dragotti, the same man who would go on to make Mr. Mom, encapsulates the iconic imagery we come to think of with Dracula, fusing the Universal and Hammer visions together, combining the eerie atmosphere and sets of one with the fog and vivid colors of the other. It just has a really wonderful theatrical quality, which kind of makes sense given that the first and biggest Dracula film was based on the stage play version of Bram Stoker's book. And the musical score by TV veteran Charles Bernstein follows suit with a great deal of old-fashioned theatricality, heavy on strings, and mania with some liberal dashings of synth and brass to add a very snazzy, at points jazz-like sound. While it does drift off into more conventional, goofy comedy score later, unlike the works of someone like John Morris, which stand up completely on their own, it does fit the film like a glove and adds to the pseudo-silly, creepy vibe of the whole affair. And finally, the time has come to bring up the script, written by the film's executive producer, Robert Kaufman. While I've made a couple of comparisons to Brooks's parody over the course of the review, it's not been without reason. After all, both are wacky parodies of the Dracula mythos, each adopting the conventional telling and then pumping in loads of crazy jokes, and both are written and directed by comedy veterans. However, while Dead and Loving It was content to just take the basic outline and just add in constant pratfalls and people banging into things over and over again, First Bite actually feels like it's making use of Dracula and vampire lore to supply its jokes. From the flamboyancy of the Count's appearance, to his transformative powers, and even the weaknesses of vampires, with one scene offering a rather amusing spin on crosses, First Bite takes the tropes and actually plays with them. Even relocating the story to more modern times, which could have been viewed as a way to just get out of building elaborate sets to replicate more conventional Dracula tellings, is also rather well employed by Kaufman and Dragoti, pointing out just how antiquated and often absurd this myth is, and how people have not only moved beyond, but even treat it with complete indifference and ridicule. By the end, you honestly feel a little sorry for the Count, as he now lives in a world that doesn't really treat him with much, if any, respect. For such a wacky film, there's a lot of real thought put into the writing here. Now, of course, this isn't to say that First Bite is some absolutely flawless, perfect comedy masterpiece of all time. While the opening is aesthetically brilliant, it does take a while for the laughs to really come along. And once that big sequence is over, Dragoti's direction, as I mentioned before, becomes a little more pedestrian, even televisual at points, when we arrive in the Big Apple. And that's really a big shame. What's more, some of the special effects, mainly involving Dracula in bat form, aren't exactly that special, and this could have worked as a little nod to past incarnations, but as Dragoti pretty much drops the stylistic homages and just goes for a very routine directing approach, the phony bats stick out painfully as just that when they fly about the city, and it just feels like one big missed opportunity there. However, none of this was enough to eclipse the film's many positives, and I had a really good time with it. And so, after all that, I must award Love at First Bite a silver star. If you were one of the many let down by Dead and loving it and still crave a competent Dracula parody, Love at First Bite may be just the ticket for you. Hamilton's charisma and enough hearty belters keep everything moving along briskly and satisfyingly enough, and honestly, it's a real treat and a nice alternative on Halloween.